Okay, good morning everyone. For those who don't know me, my name's Adam Tomison. I'm the Director of the AIC. Welcome this morning to this seminar that I'm presenting on our research looking at the victimisation of international students from 2005 to 2009. Most of you will probably know this report, the research report that was based on these findings was in fact released in August 2011. The report's actually there if you want to take a hard copy of it for yourself. But I'm going to give essentially what I gave 2 weeks ago at the Australian New Zealand Society of Criminology's conference, a keynote address that essentially covers the main findings, some of the implications of the research, some of the flaws in the research or areas we could actually improve it, and generally just take you through what we found. So that's the plan. And I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal people, and paying my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also recognise the two other authors of the report that I'm going to be talking about today. That's Jackie Judo-Larson and Jason Payne, both AIC staff members who did a fantastic job getting the research done. As Director, I got to sort of sit back and essentially order them around, but they did all the hard work. They did a very good job, so yeah, I just want to acknowledge them. Okay, so the report is available online. It has been out since mid-August, and there are some hard copies there for you to take. Okay, so you might as well begin. Okay, so in 2008-2009 there was growing concern by governments and segments of the community that Indian international students were being targeted in racially motivated attacks. The incident sparked debate over racism in Australia. There was some anecdotal evidence that race played a role in some of the offences committed against international students. Information that was provided to the Indian Parliament on attacks against Indian nationals, both students and others, made reference to racial abuse, to racial remarks, to derogatory comments on Indian appearance, people being told to remove their turbans and being told to go back to India. Among the approximately 50 incidents involving the assault of an Indian student, mention of racial abuse or derogatory comments based on the victim's appearance was evident or recorded in 12 cases, so about a quarter of the 50 incidents that were passed on to the Indian Parliament. And such incidents were a concern on a number of levels. The harm done to the students and their families, both physical and psychological harm, the possible increase in fear of crime and safety concerns amongst Australian migrant communities, the impact on education providers, and the damage to Australia's international standing as a safe, diverse and welcoming country. However, beyond these individual cases, there was no real data available to investigate the nature and extent of attacks on Indian and other international students. There were a small number of surveys, student surveys of their perceptions of safety, which I'm going to talk a little bit about this morning before we get into our own research. But there wasn't any hard data, recorded crime data that we could easily draw upon to give us an idea of the size of the problem. So what I'm going to present today are the results of the AIC's research into overseas student victimisation. And this is the first Australian study that can quantify the extent to which international students from the 5 major student source countries were victims of crime between 2005 and 2009, as indicated by an analysis of recorded crime. And that's an important point I want to come back to later. That's what we know from the recorded crime stats. This was achieved by matching students' immigration data with police crime records to assess criminal victimisation. It's the first time such administrative data has been able to be used in this way, so it's another first for us. And it was only possible due to the support of the Department of Immigration and Citizenship and the State and Territory Police agencies. Okay. Further, the study has enabled some exploration as to whether international students are more or less likely to be victims of particular crime types, and it sheds some light on some of the factors that may increase or decrease the risk of victimisation. So as I said before, I'm going to talk about the key findings from the research, some of the limitations of the study, and offer some suggestions for the next steps forward as well in terms of research. As I mentioned, there are several surveys of student safety that have been conducted in Australia. In 2009-10, the Australian Education International Group commissioned research on the satisfaction of international students, and they found that a large majority of those surveyed indicated they felt fairly safe or very safe when on campus. In the higher education sector, 86% of international students and 94% of domestic students reported high levels of satisfaction on safety. Other studies have found similarly high levels of feelings of safety among international students. I would of course note that the feelings of safety amongst international students weren't as high as for the domestic students. In their survey of 200 international students at 9 Australian public universities, Marginson et al. From Monash University found that the majority of students reported feeling safe and secure, 91% of students, However, there was a perception based on both direct experience and the experiences of friends that students were sometimes targeted due to their racial appearance, and 11.5% of respondents felt that way. Feelings of safety in Australia also differed on the basis of national or cultural origin. Indian students were more likely to respond that they did not feel safe. 19% of Indian students felt that way. Compared with students from China, 14% felt that they did not feel safe. Malaysia, 6%, and Indonesia, 4%. A small number of students from various countries reported being the victim of assault, robbery and burglary, but many more knew someone who had actually experienced one of the crimes. So often it was about their circle of friends and acquaintances rather than their actual direct experiences. Another recent report investigating the safety of international students in public and private institutions in Melbourne reported that 82% of the 830 respondents that were surveyed felt that Melbourne was a safe place to live. Over 3/4 of international students, 78%, compared with 86% of local students felt this was the case. So again, we've got this distinction. We've still got high ratings of safety, but international students aren't feeling quite as safe as their local students. However, it's also important to note that half of the international student respondents, about 201 students, indicated that when safety was threatened, they believed there was a racial, religious or cultural element to the threat, compared with 17% of local students. Now, Babakan et al. In this survey found that the international student safety was linked to the vulnerability of students due to the relative absence of family support, limited understanding or access to services, and relatively limited options in terms of transport, housing and employment. While the body of Australian research on migrants as perpetrators of crime has grown steadily over the years, comparatively little is known about migrants as victims of crime more generally, and less is known about the victimisation of international students in particular, hence the need for this study. With regard to criminal justice administrative data, information concerning the nationality, ethnicity, country of birth and visa status of victims of crime isn't routinely collected, with the exception of the identification of victims and offenders who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Where such identification, while imperfect, has been used to identify the nature and extent of offending and to identify biases in the criminal justice system. In essence, for such data to be incorporated into a police case file, the investigating police members must form the view that such material is germane or relevant to the crimes alleged to have occurred. Further, nationality or ethnicity is generally identified through the police member's perceptions, not through direct questioning. In other words, if I have a person reporting a crime to me and I think they look Indian, I'm going to write down they're Indian where it's relevant for the case. I may be wrong. It's just based on perceptions. They may be from Pakistan, they may be from Sri Lanka, they may be from Russia. It's really hard to know. So there's a bit of error, a lot of room for error in this sort of data. The New South Wales Police have actually developed a racially motivated crime database, and we actually looked at this, or tried to look at this as part of our research, but it wasn't found to be a reliable means of capturing crimes against international students, so that we haven't actually pursued that area. So the question should be asked, should ethnicity be recorded? Certainly it'd be great for researchers, because of course once that data is in, we can start playing with it and trying to identify trends in crime and in victimisation. But the routine collection of such material would bring with it its own ethical, privacy and victim-related concerns. First, police services are expected to uphold the law regardless of the nationality, ethnicity or visa status of victims. And collecting such material on a routine basis may lead to perceptions by the community that police are racially profiling victims and offenders, or that such issues are affecting the objectivity of the police response. Second, direct questioning of victims on these matters may intimidate some victims from coming forward and therefore reduce reporting, which is obviously something we don't want to happen. Now, some may argue the study I'm going to present to you today is actually evidence that this isn't really a big concern, that people will still report crimes. I think the jury's still out on that, but we'll talk further about it when you see the size of the samples we looked at. So to the AIC's research. Well, while Indian students were a focus, as you might imagine, given the community interest in the area and the government interest in the area, we also wanted to explore the experiences of other international student groups. So we chose the top 5 source countries for international students going to Australia for the 2005-2009 period. And these countries were the People's Republic of China, India, the Republic of South Korea, Malaysia and the United States. The United States is quite a nice little comparison because the other 4 countries are of course Asia Pacific and the United States isn't. Well, it is in a sense, but it's a different sort of population, so it's a bit more, it's a nice comparison for us to have a look at. And we had some key research questions, and they were, firstly, are Indian students more likely to be the victims of crime than a general population of the same age? Is that victimisation racially motivated? Are Indian students more likely to be victims of crime compared with other international student groups? And what factors or risks, if any, can distinguish between Indian victims and other victims of crime? But before we launched our main study, we tried to find other relevant data sources that might be available to inform our analysis. Several other surveys were identified, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics Crime Victimisation Survey and the ABS General Social Survey. However, analysis of the data from ABS sources was limited by an inability to narrow country of birth data to persons born in India, which is obviously one of our focus areas, due to either issues relating to survey design or confidentiality. So it didn't really help us much. We also looked at the Australian component of the 2004 International Crime Victimisation Survey. And this produced no evidence of significantly increased reporting of personal victimisation by overseas-born students compared with Australian-born students. However, we're talking about a survey that had a very small sample size overall, and that there was a failure of the survey to capture the range of factors that might influence reporting. And the risk factors for victimisation meant that the role of racial motivation and many other factors that might affect the prevalence of crimes against overseas-born students were unable to be identified or investigated further. So in other words, there was no evidence found in the survey, but it was really pretty basic stuff. We wouldn't need to go much deeper to try and get a better analysis, so we can't really use that as the source, if you like, of concluding there was no issue with racial victimisation or racial motivation in crime. We then looked at the National Homicide Monitoring Program, which the AIC has been running now for many years, and we looked and analysed homicide cases collected from 1990 to 2008. And we identified 8 Indian students who'd been killed during this time. And we wanted to look at who killed the students and what was the motivation for that. None of these incidents, the 8 incidents, were deemed by police officers or the AIC to have been racially motivated or to involve racial discrimination after detailed assessment of the case files. In fact, of the cases where motive was known, most were related to disputes over money, desertion or domestic-related arguments, and the perpetrators were basically, or predominantly, family, friends and housemates. So that didn't really show any racial motivation at all, but again, the sample size, by definition, is very small. So what do we try and do? Well, in the absence of the identification of ethnicity in police records, it was proposed to match identifying information from student visa applications held by the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, DIAC, against victims of crime data held by police. In that way, student ethnicity and basic demographics would be confirmed from a reliable source and linked to reported victimisation. And we started with a total population of 497,000 individual student records provided in the initial data extract from DIAC. The DIAC database included both primary and secondary applicants, visa applicants. A primary applicant is a person who's seeking to study at an Australian institution. A secondary applicant is essentially, and they made up 10% of the sample, essentially a spouse, someone accompanying the primary applicant, a child, those sorts of people generally speaking. And we had to actually exclude the secondary visa holders from our analysis, and I'll explain why we did that later. What we were left with was between 2005 and 2009, 418,294 international students from the 5 source countries. There was a 28% rise in commencements from 2005 to 2009, peaking at 95,553 students in 2008. And this was due mainly to a substantial increase in the number of arrivals from India, which more than doubled from 2005 to 2009. Arrivals declined by 6% from 2008 to 2009, and that was primarily driven by a decrease in Indian students and also by Korean students and US students. Conversely, the number of students from China and Malaysia actually increased in 2009. So that broadly gives you the pattern of student visa applications for that period. So we broke down, obviously, this data into the 5 source countries. And what's probably worth noting is that the primary visa holder sample, 35% of all student visa holders came from the People's Republic of China, 26% came from India. In terms of residency, overall 35% of all students ended up residing in New South Wales and 34% resided in Victoria. the two biggest jurisdictions by population, the two biggest jurisdictions by number of tertiary institutions, perhaps not unexpected. It's important to note, though, that Indians made up 44% of all international students who ended up in Victoria. And you might remember that Victoria was particularly an area where there's a lot of media stories and community concern around attacks on Indian students. So what did we do? Well, firstly, we looked at our ethics, obviously. The research had the AIC Human Ethics Committee's approval and was also granted a 12-month temporary public interest determination by the Commonwealth Privacy Commissioner to use the immigration data. That was important because this is the first time we could actually use student visa data to actually look at recorded crime. There was a 21-day opt-out period provided to students, so they had an opportunity to withdraw from the study if they wished, and that was offered through DIAC. So to the process, what do we do? Okay, so we had our ethics, we had our application for the Privacy Commissioner, we had our opt-out period, then it came down to extracting data. And DIAC created two data sets. The first one included student visa holders' names, date of birth and their CRICOS number. CRICOS is the Commonwealth Register of Institutions and Courses for Overseas Students. And basically it tells us where the people want to study and what jurisdiction they're going to study in, which is important so we could actually link them to a particular jurisdiction. So this information was provided for all student visa holders and was provided to police services along with the unique student identification number that we created for this project. Second sample, DIAC also gave the AIC a second de-identified sample of student visa holders' basic demographics together with a unique student identifier number. So we have a data set that's de-identified but with more demographic information. The police have the names and date of birth and the CRICOS number, and they can use those to match with the recorded crime databases. So police matched the DIAC data looking at names and dates of birth against the victimisation databases, and they matched in two waves. The first time they did, they tried to push all the names through their databases, just the full name and date of birth, to try and get a match. The second wave they did was to try and use full name and date of birth match, but they used Soundex. And Soundex is a phonetic algorithm program that converts names into alphanumeric code based on its phonetic structure and enables greater pickup of misspelt names. So basically, my name's Tomison, it's always being misspelt. To try and pick up the variations in spelling, Soundex creates, if you like, an algorithm or a particular nameplate that can be used and will actually pick up all the different variations of Tomlinson, Thomason, Tomison with an H, Tomison without an H, etc., etc. So it actually gave us, if you like, a greater hope of actually picking up on students who'd been reported as victims of crime. So based on these analyses, police extracted and provided a de-identified sample of visa holders who reported being a victim of crime and sent it to the AIC. At the AIC, we then merged the data set, so the one we've already been given by DIAC with the police data set, which gave us students who'd been victimised using the unique student identification number. We then cleaned and coded the police data sets to ensure that there was interjurisdictional comparability, and then merged the initial de-identified DIAC data given to the AIC. This is really easy, it sounds really easy, but in fact it went through months of work to try and get these things as accurate as possible. We also did a search across police databases, which that yielded a total of 23,732 records of offences against the primary student visa holder between 2005 and 2009. We excluded secondary visa holders because we weren't able to link them directly to the primary visa holders and their CRICOS number. The result was we couldn't actually, for example, put the husband or the wife of a student visa holder together in the data. So therefore we couldn't tell whether the secondary visa holders were in Victoria, New South Wales, Darwin, wherever. So we couldn't actually find any way of actually associating or linking them to a particular jurisdiction, so we had to exclude them. We also removed duplicate records, incorrect records, and also some offence types such as disorderly conduct, traffic and driving offences which couldn't be reasonably counted as incidents of victimisation. In other words, they were victimless crimes. We also had to remove offence types with the sample sizes that were too small. In particular, for example, sexual assault, which I think was about 150 to 200 cases at most, and fraud offences. They were just too few to allow us to run meaningful comparisons. What we ended up with is basically what you see before you. We end up with 13,204 unique victims of crime for 14,855 offences. And we classify them into three broad crime types using the ABS recorded crime victims classification: assault, robbery and other theft. And now we get to the data. Okay, some demographic data to start with. What this graph tells us is, and this is a graph of age obviously, of the student visa holders, more than half, 56% of all students studying in Australia were aged between 20 and 24 years. You might expect that. A further 1 in 4, 26% were aged between 25 and 34 years, while 17% were aged between 15 and 19 years. Only 2% were aged 35 years or older. And overall, the findings suggested that the students from China, Malaysia and the US were on average younger than their counterparts from India and the Republic of Korea. We also had a look at gender, and just over half of all international students commencing study in Australia were male, 55% in fact. However, if you look at these graphs, it's very clear that most of our males, or a lot of our males, more than our males than you expect, and the other populations are coming from India. 74% of the Indian sample were males, compared with the other student populations, where in fact males were more likely to be the smaller proportion of the two genders. So females basically outnumbered males for pretty much all the rest of the student samples. So clearly what we've got is some age and gender differences between the student samples. Further, the general age and gender population of, or profile, sorry, of students differed significantly from the profile of the broader Australian population, for which jurisdictional recorded crime rates were calculated. So without adjusting these in some sense, these differences would likely have significant implications for comparing findings. So for example, in New South Wales in 2005, the proportion of male students aged between 20 and 24 years from the 5 source countries was much higher than the proportion of males of the same age in the general New South Wales population, using ABS population figures. So to correct for this, we basically weighted the data. We calculated data weights as proportional to the average age and gender distribution across each of the 5 source countries, and applied that to the groups, such as those countries with a higher than average number of 20 to 24-year-old males, India and China and Malaysia, and we weighted down the age category. They were weighted down to basically reach the average, while those with a lower than average proportion were weighted up. So essentially we tried to even things up. And once we calculated for each age and gender, each age and gender combination in each jurisdiction, the weights were then used to multiply the crime victimisation counts to derive the final weighted victimisation rates per 1,000 persons. We tried to weight the data to make it more comparable, and we've also tried to set it up so we're giving crime rates as per 1,000 victims. I can put that fairly simply. Before we get into the real sort of nitty-gritty, it's good to look at what this research can do and what it can't do. First thing is that what it can do is give us estimates of the rates of recorded victimisation of international students by nation and gender for 3 broad crime types: assault, robbery and other theft. And I'll talk about other theft in a sec. It allows us to compare with the Australian population using the ABS recorded crime victims dataset to do a calculation of the rate of victimisation for persons aged between 15 to 44 years, which covers 97% of the student age range. And it's the best, in fact it's the only national and jurisdictional estimates of the extent of recorded crime victimisation in this country for overseas students. Okay, so obviously what we've done is we've used the best available searching techniques we could employ, but of course these are always going to be imperfect and there may have been some error in the resultant databases. However, we think the risk of a false positive or a false negative result are probably roughly equal. We think we've done the best we can to come up with a nicely balanced, pretty reliable set of data. It's worth noting though, because with the other theft data, the Australian Bureau of Statistics was unable to provide age and gender breakdowns for other theft data from the recorded crime victims database. So while we could do comparisons with the state populations, and that these suggested a small number of cases where Indian students had higher rates of other theft, these comparisons weren't reliable. So essentially we had to focus on assault and robbery data. The other theft data really isn't something we can hang our hat on as being definitive. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk mainly about assault and robbery. Okay, what can't the research provide? Well, the research was designed to provide an estimation of the rate of victimisation, recorded victimisation for the 5 main overseas student groups, and to compare this with the Australian reference populations. What it can't do, well, it can't give us an estimation of the extent to which international students are committing crimes, or the relationship between victimisation and offending, and we know that there's often an overlap between those who are committing crimes and those who are victims of crimes. It's not a perfect overlap, but there is an overlap. We can't check that. We can't get into detailed jurisdictional comparisons because of differences in jurisdictions' legislation, policy and practice. We can't give you a detailed exploration of the causes and risk factors for international students becoming a victim of crime because we've gone for the numbers. We're trying to estimate the size of the problem, and that means by definition you can't get some of the specificity that you can get through qualitative, detailed research. And that's been done by others in more smaller studies. And I can't give you a precise determination of the extent to which offending is racially motivated. We didn't have any access at all to offender data. We couldn't assess the overlap between victimisation and offending, nor could we interrogate the victim's statements in detail to actually determine issues of racial motivation or racial vilification in offending. So we've gone for a numbers approach, and that's deliberate because until this study was done, there were no numbers. So it's important that we focus on that. We also can't assess the extent to which there was non-reporting or under-reporting of particular crime types. Now we know in the Australian population, in most populations, that certain types of crimes are under-reported. Fraud and sexual assault are two that come to mind immediately. And it's probably the case as well that overseas students aren't reporting those crimes as much as they would report, for example, theft of a wallet or theft of a computer. It may also be the case that overseas students are less likely to go to police in Australia because of cultural experience of the police in their own countries, or a reluctance to go to police sources just generally, and a preference to go to their own embassies or consulates to report crime there. There are certainly instances of that happening. But we don't know how much under-reporting is going on, and there's no way to find out from this sort of study or from the study that's been done to date. So this, of course, we're doing our research based on recorded crime, so we can't get to the stuff that isn't recorded. It's important to note. And it's for these reasons that we've actually proposed large-scale crime victimisation surveys of migrant populations and with an emphasis on overseas students to try and tease out some of these issues in more detail. But having said all that, we still have good results, and I'm now going to present them to you. Okay, I'm going to start with assault, and I'll just try and explain this table for you. What we did was we did a number of comparisons for each of the jurisdictions, as you can see here. In each jurisdiction, apart from NT, where there was virtually no data on overseas students because there weren't that many overseas students. And what we did was we compared in each case the assault rates of Indian students, for example, against the general population figures in each jurisdiction, and then assault rates for the other student groups, the students from China, Malaysia, the US and Korea against Indian students to see if we could find some significant differences. That's what we tried to do. Okay, now when you see a down arrow, what that means is that the rate of assault, for example, taking the first box here, the rate of assault for Indian students is actually significantly lower, I should say, significantly lower than the rate for the general population in New South Wales. Whereas if you look at the next line down, the up arrow is indicating the rate of assault for Indian students is significantly higher than other student groups in New South Wales over that period of time. An equal sign means there's basically no significant difference, that the rates were equivalent. So does that make sense to everyone? So down arrow means basically we've got lower rates of assault in this particular case. Up arrow means a significantly higher rate of assault than other student groups in this particular graph. So what you can see is, in essence, overall, what we've got here is a situation where Indian students were either as likely or significantly less likely to be the victim of assault across these jurisdictions in the 2005 to 2009 period. But when you compare the Indian students against other student groups, you find that whilst they weren't being assaulted at a significantly higher rate than the general population, they were assaulted more often than the other student groups that were present in this study. So other international student groups had a much less rate of assault in each of these jurisdictions, or certainly for New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland and WA. But overall the story is that Indian students weren't assaulted they weren't more likely to be assaulted than any other person in the New South Wales population. Does that make sense? Now you don't want to be doing national comparisons of assault data because the collection and recording issues across the jurisdictions of how we actually record assault are quite difficult to work our way through. So basically these are just jurisdiction by jurisdiction. We shouldn't be looking at a national picture here. But what we've got is that all student groups reported assaults significantly less often than the Australian comparison populations, but in some jurisdictions, Indian students in some years had higher rates of assault than students from China, Korea, Malaysia and the US. We then looked at the temporal pattern of assault. When was the assault occurring? And we found that for all international students assaulted between 2005 and 2009, most were assaulted in the evening hours between the hours of 8 p.m. and midnight, 31% were assaulted then, and between midnight and 4 a.m, 29% were assaulted then. Relatively few assaults occurred during the daytime hours between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m, and the distribution of assaults across the week was relatively even, but slightly skewed towards the weekend, which is pretty much what you'd expect. There weren't any differences between students from different countries in the distribution of incidents. Now, while there was no nationally comparable data we could use on time of day and day of week of assaults, crime stats published by Victoria presented a similar temporal pattern. So this was not really unexpected. It pretty much fits with the general Australian population, we could conclude. We looked at location of assaults, where were assaults occurring. We combined the data for all jurisdictions for overseas students for the 2005-2009 period, and what was evident was that 2 in every 5 assaults, 42%, occurred in an unspecified location on the street or in the open space. A further 21% occurred at a residential location, 12% at a commercial or retail location, and 10% at a commercial location such as a hospitality, entertainment sort of venue such as a pub, a motel, a nightclub, a restaurant. And finally, about 1 in 10 incidents was recorded at or in connection with public transport facilities. And this profile of assault was generally consistent with the profile of assault for the general population. But there are a few noticeable differences. Indian male students were more likely to have been assaulted at a commercial retail location, 16% of them, compared with Chinese students, 9%, Korean students, 4%, Malaysians, 9%, and US students, 4%. So basically, Indian students were 2 to 3 times as likely to have been assaulted at a commercial retail location. Indian male students were more likely to have been assaulted on or around public transport facilities. Again, at least double, if not 5 or 6 times more likely to have been assaulted around public transport compared with other international student groups. And conversely, Indian students had proportionally fewer residential assaults compared with Chinese students. We then had a look at robbery, and robbery was much more concerning for us. I mean, all crime committed against anyone, student or otherwise, is a concern. But when you're starting to get figures where all the arrows are up, essentially what you're showing is a greater proportion or a significantly higher rate of crime being committed against students, Indian students in particular, and we'll talk you through that. So as you can see, the difference between the assaults and the robbery. What we've got here essentially is that in 5 states, Indian students were significantly more likely to be assaulted than the general population figures. And we've also got Indians more likely to be assaulted compared with other student groups in the 2 biggest jurisdictions, New South Wales and Victoria. But the top line is particularly concerning. And in essence, what we found was that the rate of robbery for male Indian students in some jurisdictions was higher than the comparison Australian population. It was higher for 5 years, the full 5-year period in New South Wales, the full 5 years in Victoria, for 2 years in South Australia, 2 years in Queensland and 3 years in Western Australia. We also found that Chinese male students were also at higher risk of victimisation compared with the state average in Queensland for 2 years, as were Indian students, female students, for 3 of the 5 years in New South Wales and for 1 year in Tasmania. Again, we looked at the location of robbery, and the robbery patterns were generally consistent between the countries and followed the patterns consistent with the Australian population. Almost 2 in 3, 63% of robberies occurred in an unspecified location on the street or in the open space. 18% occurred at a commercial or retail location, 9% on or near public transport, and 4% at a residential location. Again, Indian students were more than twice as likely to have been the victim of robberies at a commercial or retail location. 24% of Indian male students were victims in a commercial or retail location, compared with 10% of Chinese students, 4% of Malaysians, 3% of Koreans, and no US students. Indian male students were also more than twice as likely to have been robbed on or around public transport facilities, 12% compared with Chinese students, 6%, Korean students, 6%, Malaysian 6%, and no US students. I'll come back to this in a minute as to why we think some of this is happening. Temporal pattern for robbery, again consistent with what we know about robbery generally, with most robberies occurring in the late evening, early mornings. And specifically, for all international students, most were robbed in the evening hours between 8 p.m. and midnight, 47%, and between midnight and 4 a.m., 23%. Relatively few robberies occurred during daylight hours between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And the distribution of robberies across the week was pretty even, if not slightly skewed towards the weekend. Again, we sort of expected that. The lack of difference between student robberies and other robberies was expected, given that robbery is primarily or typically an opportunistic crime, which is not traditionally racially motivated. So we didn't really not expect those results. We wanted to look a bit further into this idea of the commercial settings for robberies and see some more about the differences. And the finding of the location where robberies occurred were largely consistent with the hypothesis that occupation and vulnerability on public transport are factors in the victimisation of overseas students. Robberies recorded against Indian students were significantly more likely, 24% of students were robbed in these locations, to have occurred in commercial retail locations, and more detailed analysis revealed that almost 3 in every 4 occurred at service station or petrol stations or 24-hour convenience stores. In comparison, only 12% of Chinese students who were robbed at a commercial location were robbed at a service or petrol station. Chinese students were more likely than Indian students to have been robbed at a shop or a store, 39% compared with 12%, and slightly more likely to have been robbed at a 24-hour convenience store, 17% of Chinese students versus 12% of Indian students. There weren't any robberies of US students at commercial retail locations, and the number of Korean and Malaysian robberies was so small, less than 10 each for each country, they're not worth considering. So really the issue comes down to Chinese and Indian students. And I think the graph shows very clearly some of the differences between the Indian students and the Chinese students in particular. So overall, in comparison with the Australian general population, Indian students were more likely to be the victim of robbery offences, especially Indian male students, and less likely or equally likely to be the victim of assault. Indian students were more likely to be victims compared with other student groups for both assault and robbery, and again, particularly for males and particularly in larger jurisdictions. So what factors distinguished between Indian victims and other victims? Well, for a start, almost half, 48% of the Indian student sample were males aged between 15 and 24 years, a much higher proportion than for students from Malaysia, which had a 41% proportion, China 39%, United States 33%, and the Republic of Korea 23%. And we know that most crime occurs in the age groups 15 to 24 years, so if you've got a large number of students who are of that age who are out in the country, the risk of them being involved in crime either as an offender or as a victim is going to be higher. But we controlled for this through the weighting process. We tried to make sure we could actually even up the samples to allow for this so it wouldn't actually affect our results. Yet we did this and we still found that Indians were being overrepresented as victims of robbery, and we still found that a higher rate of assault than other international student groups. What might be happening? What are the possible explanations? Well, Indian students in particular are known to have a greater proficiency in English, and as the data showed, we're much more likely than students from East Asia to be employed in the service sector, including service stations, convenience stores, taxi drivers and other employment that typically involves working late nights and working late nights alone. They had a higher rate of victimisation around public transport. Again, probably a nighttime economy effect. They're out and about getting home and going to work at times of the day when most people aren't, when there is an increased risk of being the victim of crime. This may also have been exacerbated by the location of residence. If you're living off campus, you may be living in areas that are cheaper, that are higher risk neighbourhoods, and as a result when you're walking through them at times of the day when it's a bit quiet, no one else is around, you may be at increased risk there too, on the transport or near the transport hubs. We actually thought we'd tease this out a bit further and have a look at some more specific data that we managed to get from South Australia, looking at victims' employment and how that might actually factor into things. What we found with the South Australian data, which gave us the employment of the victims, was that there was a link between higher rates of robbery and assault and type of employment. A substantially higher proportion of Indian male students were recorded as taxi drivers than for any other student group. This indicates that a sizable proportion of robberies and assaults against Indian students were likely to have occurred during the course of their employment in the taxi industry. We can't prove it, but we think there's enough data there to sort of give us reason to draw that conclusion as one possible explanation. So for assaults, 44% of Indian male students who were a victim of assault were recorded as taxi drivers, compared with 7% of Chinese males, for example. For robbery, 27% of Indian male students had their occupation recorded as taxi driver, and for other theft, 43% of Indian male students had their occupation recorded as a taxi driver. For all international students who were robbed between 2005-2009, 70% of robberies took place between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m, and as was the case for assault, while there was no difference identified between student groups and the Australian comparison populations with regard to the timing of robberies, there were higher numbers of students working in industries that are identified as being at higher risk. Taxi drivers, convenience stores, 7-Elevens, service stations are all areas that are well known in the armed robbery data as being at high risk. If more people are working in those industries, the rate of risk of being a victim of crime is going to increase. So again, this idea of the nighttime economy and then transport to and from work, for example, may be a good explanation for some of what's going on in terms of these data we've come across and analysed. So the big question is racial motivation. What can we say about it? Well, overall, nothing in the overall findings lent support to the view that Indian students were singled out primarily for racial reasons. The nature of the available data didn't allow us, though, to engage in really specific analysis of racial motivation. I've talked before about we didn't have access to the case files, we didn't have access to victims' statements, we didn't have access to offender statements, so we aren't ruling it out, we can't rule it out. But there may be other reasons that are happening that may actually lead to a range of reasons that might lead to offences being committed. That students were not singled out primarily for racial reasons was also supported by Marginson et al.'s Monash 2010 survey of students regarding their perceptions of safety. And we've got some data that seems to support the view that maybe there wasn't primarily a racial motivation. One, assault rates on Indian students were either below or the same as the rates of assault for the general Australian population, suggesting maybe race wasn't a primary motivation. Further, a detailed analysis of national homicide data of the 8 cases we could find, none of the incidents were deemed to have a racial motivation. Yet despite these findings, the study cannot, and we aren't, ruling out racial motivation entirely, and it may also be that while racial vilification is not the primary motivation, racial targeting may be occurring in terms of perceptions of who may be an easier target for crime, particularly for opportunistic crimes like robbery. Now we know that when people are looking to select a victim of crime, they may choose a victim because they're seen as being too old or too young, of being female rather than male, of being infirm, unable to defend themselves, of being isolated rather than moving around in a group. And there are a range of other traits that may make people identified as, if you like, a target of choice or as a potential victim. And it's not out of the question that some of the international students are seen as being easier targets by some offenders. But we have to explore this further, as I've said. We haven't done it in this study, it has to be looked at further. So how can we improve the findings? I mean, again, like any piece of research, it's not perfect, but I think it was a pretty good effort. And it was the first time we could try and produce this sort of a quantifiable sort of analysis of the size of the problem, the victimisation of international students. Well, we compared our student groups, we weighted and compared them with data from all Australians aged 15 to 44 years. A comparison with Australian student populations would be more accurate. We couldn't actually access that and would actually require the universities to give us access to their data sources, their actual demographics on student numbers, almost like a student census. We can't do that yet. As we've said a number of times already, access to data on offenders and offending, in addition to victimisation data, would actually give us more of a picture of what's going on. We would have liked to have included the secondary visa holder data as well, what was happening to spouses, to children, to other people accompanying primary visa holders. We couldn't do that because we couldn't identify their location. If we managed to do that in the future, we'd love to try to go back and include those in a follow-up study. Also, access to ABS unit record data would have facilitated other weighting options we could have used. For example, we could have looked at weighting based on employment to see whether the employment factor came out when we actually weighted for it. In fact, other factors were having more impact on whether Indians or other overseas students were being more likely to be the victim of crime. So it would give us more comparability options. We couldn't do that for this study at the moment. So future research, well, AIC has proposed that we obviously don't give up here, that we actually look further into these issues. The first thing we've proposed is doing is a large-scale crime victimisation survey of Australian migrant populations with an oversampling of international students. So what does all that mean? What we've got is we've got a number of small studies that have looked at a small number of individuals who've been victims of crime and have given their perceptions of what's happened to them. We've now got this big study which gives us the quantification of the problem, the size of the problem. We have to actually mesh them up, and the best way to do that is to do a large-scale, large-numbered survey where we actually talk to people who've been victims of crime across Australian migrant communities and talk about the issues of have they reported or not, what do they think was happening to them and why, how could it be prevented, and also what's their role in relationship with the police. Reporting to police, reporting to other agencies, what would actually improve the reporting of crime and improve their experience. We actually want to do this piece of work, but it's fairly expensive, and that's an understatement, so we'll have to see if we can actually find the money to do it. We've also suggested doing a biennial national crime monitoring program, essentially repeating the work I've just presented to you today, doing it every 2 or 3 years, doing the same exercise and essentially monitoring the victimisation of overseas students across time. And that's also possible if the Department of Immigration and the State and Territory Police Services see it as a good thing to do, and that's still something we're discussing. Obviously, if we could identify overseas students as victims in police records, we could also then do in-depth analysis ourselves on the case records that were being kept. We can't do that yet, so obviously that's another thing we'd like to do, but which isn't quite possible right now. So overall, this analysis of international students as recorded victims of crime in Australia essentially indicates that international students are less likely or as likely to be victims of physical assault than the wider population. Further, that the level of crime experienced by international students of different nationalities varied, with Indian students typically experiencing the same or a heightened incidence of assault than other student nationalities. The findings for robbery were more concerning, or certainly were concerning to us, in that international students, again predominantly Indian students, males and females, but also Chinese males, were significantly more likely to be the victim of robbery for some jurisdictions, or in some jurisdictions, in some years, compared with the Australian reference populations that we could draw from the ABS stats for each jurisdiction. Although the findings from the study indicated higher than average rates of robbery among Indian international students compared with the general population, and higher rates of assault for Indian students compared with students from other countries, they should not yet be interpreted as evidence of racism. On face value, the idea of the Australian community engaging in widespread racial targeting of international students, especially Indian students, appears not to be well founded. There is certainly, though, a need for further investigation of racial motivation in offending. That's certainly required, and I think that's the next thing we should be trying to do. But there are a number of other differences, other than a person's racial appearance, that are likely to vary significantly between different student groups, and that may be important contributors to one's risk of victimisation. This study, and also some of the previous surveys, have identified types of employment, areas of residence and evening activities, being out and about for shift work, use of public transport, and out for entertainment purposes, are specific areas of risk for international students that appear to explain some of the incidents of robbery for Indian students in particular. The limited availability of on-campus accommodation for higher education students, the lack of accommodation on campus for vocational students may also have led to some to secure private rentals in inner city, urban areas, as well as to rely on public transport in areas with higher concentrations of crime. Thus, together with their overrepresentation as employees in the hospitality and services sector, the need to use public transport and to work at night in higher risk occupations, perhaps together with a lack of awareness of personal safety practices in the Australian context or Australian environment, means that students are therefore faced with multiple risk factors that increase their probability of victimisation irrespective of their racial appearance. And this supports Babakan et al.'s conclusions about employment, residence, lack of family support as being important factors in the risk of harm, but with better data. This research provides a solid foundation for studies of student victimisation. For the first time, we've actually got recorded crime data and analysis of recorded crime data that gives us the quantification, the quantity of crime that's occurring against overseas student populations. We haven't had that before, so it's an important step. But clearly further work is required to investigate more fully the extent to which overseas students will report or won't report being victims of crime, the extent of any racial motivation in the offending, and the risk factors and strategies that can reduce the risk of crime. And this task falls not only to the education sector and the criminal justice sector, but should also be part of the crime prevention strategies enacted by the owners and operators of businesses that are more at risk of falling victims to attack or robbery. The AIC hasn't given up on this area of research. We're pursuing funding opportunities to see if we can take this further and create a more detailed analysis of what's actually occurring in terms of racial motivation of attacks and offences committed against international students. But for the moment, that's our first big report, and thank you for attending today.